following sermon was delivered at the 10:30 worship service at the United Methodist Church of Kent. Please enjoy.
Earlier this year, the Palestinian librarian and poet Mossab Abu Toha published a new collection of poetry titled Forest of Noise. It is at once a beautiful and an absolutely heartbreaking testament to his and many others' experiences living in Gaza in the final few months of last year. After their family home was destroyed by Israeli bombs, Abu Toha and his wife and young children fled to the Jabalia camp in northern Gaza, a refugee camp that had been established all the way back in 1948 to house Palestinians who had been expelled from their homes at that time. Last December, for us last Advent, as Israeli defense forces attacked the refugee camp itself, when Abu Toha and his family attempted to flee once again, he was detained, he was stripped naked, and he was beaten for 2 days until finally international pressure was able to provide for his release. Eventually, after some more time had lapsed, he and his immediate family were able finally to leave Gaza, although many of his extended family members were not. And the Jabalia camp, which had been their temporary refuge, was almost entirely destroyed. Amid so much chaos and violence and grief, Abu Toha kept on writing poetry, and through that poetry offering glimpses of humanity, glimpses of life in the struggle to survive the unlivable. One of those poems, a poem titled Rescue Plane, seems especially appropriate for this Advent season. I wish I had a rescue plane to fly over Gaza, to drop wheat flour and tea bags, tomatoes and cucumbers, to remove the rubble of the houses, to retrieve the corpses of my loved ones. I wish for a second rescue plane to drop flowers for children, the ones still alive, to plant on the graves of their parents and siblings in the streets or schoolyards. The wish behind the wish? I wish there were no planes at all. I wish there were no war. I wish we never had to wish. The season of Advent is our season to acknowledge, our season to feel and to articulate as best we can the wishes behind our wishes, the deepest longings of our hearts beneath the surface level ones, our longing for a more loving world, our longing for peace, our longing for safety, both for ourselves and for our neighbors, our longing for an end to all the hostilities, all the animosities that keep on tearing us and our world apart, our longing for love that is patient and kind, love that is generous and just, love that casts out all of our fears of one another, a love that trusts and hopes and endures, a love that never fails. That is what we sing about. That is what we pray about throughout this Advent season, our longing for God's beloved world. It's what we try to express as best as we are able, our longing, our anticipation, as we look and lean and live forward with hopeful expectation, trusting in that day which is yet to come, trusting indeed that that day is yet to come, when we won't have to wish anymore, because all will be well. But until then, we wait. Until then, we prepare. Until then, we explore and express our longing as we live toward that more loving world. And how do we do so? How do we persevere? How do we keep going when the going gets so very hard? How do we avoid sliding or slipping into cynicism or despair when hatred and violence seem so very prevalent? And how do we avoid settling for something less than God's new world? How do we keep hoping toward God's dream? Well, today's two readings from Philippians and from Luke both remind us that we do so always together, that we cannot go it alone. We cannot stay alert and focused and committed alone. We cannot sustain ourselves alone. And in an expression of God's extraordinary generosity, by God's grace, God has given us to each other. God has invited us by grace to companion each other, to accompany one another, to live in solidarity and mutuality, to hang in with each other, continuing to trust always in God's love that never fails. Today's first reading is from Philippians, a letter, you might recall, written by Paul while he's in prison to the Christian community in Philippi. He isn't with the Philippian church physically, and yet through their partnership in ministry, through their partnership in God's grace, they are held together even while they are apart. And Paul feels that connection. Paul is buoyed by that partnership. He's encouraged and uplifted so he can keep on keeping on, and he trusts that they will be too. The accompaniment, the companionship, the partnership of the Philippian church is a blessing for Paul while he waits. It is the source and the strength of his joy while he longs for God's more beloved world. Though written from prison, the letter to the Philippians overflows with joy. I am thankful for all of you every time I pray, Paul writes, and it is a prayer always full of joy. Now, he isn't full of joy as he's writing this letter because of his circumstances. He isn't full of joy because all of his wishes already have been fulfilled. He is full of joy, he tells his companions, because of the way you have been my partners in the ministry of the gospel from the time you first believed it until now. We all, like Paul, need partners in ministry. We all need these companions, especially while we're all still living in Advent. Not just the season of Advent, but indeed our whole lives lived in between the world as it is and the world as it is becoming. For yes, God has come to us in Jesus of Nazareth, and yes, certainly God always is coming to us in countless other ways, in the goodness of creation, in the goodness of our own hearts. Continuously, God is coming to us every day in big ways and small ways, in loud voices and in sheer silence, in ways we notice and infinitely more ways that we ignore. And yet, though God is coming to us now, yet the final fulfillment of God's promises, the ultimate restoration and healing of all creation, the birth of a more peaceable and just and equitable world, obviously that is not here yet. And it's hard for us to wait for it. It's hard to witness and to experience the harm in life between here and there. And so we need companions. We need partners that we can lean on while they lean on us, so we can keep walking this way together. Every year during Advent, I love rediscovering again the story that we read in today's gospel, the story of Mary and Elizabeth. For what a beautiful partnership it is that they share. What powerful companionship. What a blessing they are to each other. And what a blessed reminder for us then of our need for one another. Immediately after Mary consents to God's announcement that she should carry God's presence in this unique way into the world, she gets up and she hurries to a small village in the Judean highlands, just on the outskirts of Jerusalem. She goes to the home of Elizabeth, her older relative, who also now is quite unexpectedly pregnant. Mary goes to Elizabeth for companionship and for consolation. And it makes me wonder whenever I read this story who I go to for those things, and I wonder this morning whom you go to. Whom do you go to see or to visit or to speak with or to spend time with in your moments of uncertainty or anxiety or change when you're beginning something big and new? Who is it? The person that you call, the one that you want to be with. Maybe it's a neighbor or a friend or a family member, someone you know will listen to you and make space for you, the person you know you can trust. It's a person, they may not always agree with you, they may not always tell you what you want to hear, but they'll always be exactly what you need them to be. As Mary walks through Elizabeth's door, we find that each of them is blessed by the other. They have a relationship of reciprocity. Mary's presence releases Elizabeth's voice. With a loud voice, Elizabeth blurts out a blessing that reaffirms what Mary has just heard from God's other messenger, Gabriel. And upon receiving that blessing, Mary's voice is released too. In the verses that follow this story, which we'll hear again in a couple of weeks, she proclaims boldly the reality of God's radically, blessedly, upside-down new world. And so we were reminded this morning in their story that our places, that our relationships, our communities or friendships of refuge, they're also places and relationships of possibility. For as we are reminded of our blessedness, as we discover rest and rootedness in the blessings of our companions, we are then able to unfurl. We are then able to open up, to grow and to flourish in community, to take risks and express creativity, responding to God's call more boldly and bravely, because we know that we aren't alone. So who has been Elizabeth for you? Or who has been your Mary? Who are those companions in your life whose presence and whose words are a blessing? Who helps you to remember that you're a blessing too? We all need those companions. We all need cohesive communities of folks who know that we cannot flourish alone, who embody the truth that staying together in life-giving relationships is the only way we keep moving forward together. John O'Donohue wrote about this idea from the Celtic tradition, an old Gaelic term, anam cara. Anam is the Gaelic word for soul and cara for friend. And so an anam cara is a soul friend or a kindred spirit. As Elizabeth and Mary are for each other, an anam cara is a teacher, a guide, a companion, someone with whom you can share your truest self, your deepest longings, your mind and your heart. Someone whose friendship, whether it lasts a whole lifetime or just for a season, someone who helps you realize your deep belonging. In our Methodist tradition, from our very beginning, folks were drawn into communities of soul friends, of kindred spirits, communities committed to watching over one another in love. Folks met together and listened together, supported and encouraged and challenged one another. And through their companionship, they were blessings to each other, sacred companions drawn into sacred communities. Oftentimes, these folks had little else in common with one another. They were unlikely companions. But their faith, their shared longing for a better, more beloved world, placed them in each other's paths and bound them to each other. And through that binding to each other, they were blessed. They were encouraged and empowered to keep living faithfully in the direction of God's dream. And so on this second Sunday of Advent, as we continue together now in this season of sacred waiting, as we continue in the season of exploring and expressing our deepest longings, may we be held in communities of Elizabeths and Marys. May we nurture each other's voices. May we build beloved community together. And may we share in these words of blessing now, this morning's affirmation of faith, as an opportunity to give thanks for all the Elizabeths, all the Marys we have known in our lives, as we continue to wait and to pray and to live our Advent prayer. Come, Lord Jesus, come.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the United Methodist Church of Kent Sermon Podcast. For more information about the church, visit www.kentmethodist.org.